The greatest and most terrible monsters in all of human history were not always those with the highest number of victims or the most powerful armies behind them. Sometimes the ultimate horror came from individuals who possessed the most twisted, darkest, and most deformed imagination. Today, together we will explore a list of 33 individuals whose actions went far beyond mere killing. They were true innovators of fear, skilled architects of pain and humiliation. From a respected doctor who transformed himself into his own living pandemic, all the way to a powerful queen who used poison as a form of national entertainment and as a pastime. These are stories that prove that historical reality can sometimes be more horrifying. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, master of psychological warfare. Edward Teach, known to the world by his terrifying name Blackbeard, was in reality not frightening, only because of the number of people he personally killed. In fact, statistically speaking, he was probably less violent and less bloodthirsty than many other pirates of his time. No, Blackbeard's true strength lay in the fact that he was a brilliant master of psychological warfare. He was a pirate who understood better than anyone else that fear is a currency more valuable and more powerful than pure gold. His genius lay in his sinister branding. Before every battle, he braided hemp cords soaked in saltpeter into his massive, dense black beard and set them on fire. He walked across the enemy's deck in a cloud of gray, biting smoke, carrying several pistols across his chest. This image made him appear like a real demon who had just risen from the deepest hell. His enemies at that moment were not merely facing an ordinary pirate, but a supernatural horror show. This devilish firework often caused opponents to surrender immediately in submission, without him having to fire even a single bullet. Phalaris, the tyrant and the brazen bull of Acragas. The ancient Greek tyrant Phalaris of Acragas proved to the world that cruelty can be elevated into an art form, even if into a monstrous and repulsive one. He commissioned the most skilled craftsmen to create a hollow, life-sized bull made of bronze. This was a grotesque work with a secret door on its side. However, it was by no means an exhibition piece. In truth, it was one of the cruelest execution devices. The unfortunate victims were locked inside the belly of the bull, and a large fire was lit beneath it, slowly roasting them alive while they remained fully conscious. But the truly devilish part in Phalaris's mind was the acoustic system inside the bull's head. Through a complex system of tubes, the screams of pain from the victims were transformed into a sound that resembled the roaring of an angry bull. It was a symphony of suffering that turned a person's final moments into a terrible spectacle for the tyrant's entertainment. Peter Niers, the nightmare of black magic in Germany. In the 16th century, when superstition and fear of the devil were at their peak, Peter Niers was the monster that haunted Germany's nightmares. On the outside, he was an ordinary highway robber who ambushed lonely travelers on dark forest roads. Yet his confessions under extreme torture painted a picture of the purest and most unfiltered evil. He admitted to committing the unbelievable number of 544 murders. He claimed to be a practitioner of black magic and said that he had deliberately targeted pregnant women in order to use their unborn fetuses in dark occult rituals. According to legend, these cruel acts gave him supernatural powers, such as the ability to become invisible before the eyes of mortals. He was the real-life bogeyman, a figure who completely blurred the boundary between an ordinary criminal and a malicious supernatural entity. Vera Renzi, the Black Widow, and her zinc coffins. Meet Vera Renzi, the Black Widow of Romania in the 1920s. She took the concept of keeping souvenirs from past relationships to a new, grim, and morbid level. Over the years, this beautiful noblewoman had a series of husbands, countless lovers, and even her own son, all of whom disappeared under mysterious circumstances. When the police finally searched her wine cellar, they did not find old wine bottles or supplies. Instead, they found neatly arranged zinc coffins. In each of these coffins lay one of her deceased partners. Vera was not only a murderer, she was a collector of human lives. It was reported that she often sat in her magnificent armchair in the middle of the coffins of her dead lovers and spoke with them for hours as if they were still alive. It was the ultimate act of narcissistic control, ensuring that her men could never leave her, not even in death. Bela Kiss, the horrifying museum inside metal barrels. In Hungary, a tinsmith named Bela Kiss operated a similarly macabre system, although with a more industrial and practical approach. When the First World War broke out, Kiss went to the front and left behind his house, as well as several large sealed metal barrels on his property. Years later, officials found inside them not gasoline supplies, as they had originally suspected, but the preserved bodies of at least 24 young women. Kiss had lured these women into his house, with false charms strangled them there, and then preserved their bodies in alcohol inside the giant barrels that he had made himself. The most frightening thing about this story is that he was never captured. He created his own private museum of death, and then simply disappeared without a trace from the memory of histories, after leaving behind a trail of horror. H. Holmes, the architect of Chicago's murder castle. H. Holmes was not only one of the first major serial killers in modern American history, he was a true architect of death. For the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, he designed and built a massive hotel that later became known as the Murder Castle. This 3-story labyrinth was a purpose-built slaughterhouse for human beings, complete with soundproof rooms, countless secret passages, and trapdoors at every corner. Some rooms were equipped with hidden gas lines so that he could conveniently suffocate his guests by pressing a button. Huge chutes carried the bodies directly into the basement of horror, where dissecting tables for anatomical studies and crematoria for the trace-free destruction of evidence stood ready. It was a terrifyingly modern industrial approach to murder, turning the entire building into an active, lurking predator. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, and the Betrayal of Trust. The horror of Harold Shipman, known around the world as Dr. Death, did not come from raw violence, but from the total and absolute betrayal of trust. He was a respected and beloved family doctor in a small English town, a man to whom his patients entrusted their deepest fears and their health. Shipman exploited this sacred trust in order to become one of the most prolific serial killers in human history. Over several decades, he murdered about 250 of his patients, mostly elderly women, through lethal injections of diamorphine. He coldly falsified their medical records and wills in order to enrich himself personally through their estates. His evil was so frightening because it happened in broad daylight and under the cover of healing. The monster was not in the dark shadows. It made friendly house visits to its victims. Peter Kürten, the unpredictable vampire of Dusseldorf. In the social instability and chaos of Germany in the 1920s, Peter Kürten spread incomparable fear. He carried out a series of horrific attacks and murders without any recognizable pattern or target group, which threw the entire public into a state of paranoia. His victims ranged from small children to adults, whom he attacked with various weapons. He received his monstrous nickname because of a deeply disturbing characteristic. He occasionally drank blood directly from the wounds of his dying victims. Kürten represented the total collapse of social order and human morality. He was a monster who walked openly through the streets and whose random cruelty made every citizen feel like a potential victim. His actions were a dark mirror of the social fragmentation of that time. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov. Behind the Iron Curtain, in a Soviet Union whose leadership officially declared society to be completely free of such crime, Andrei Chikatilo was a system failure of such enormous proportions that he was not supposed to exist officially at all. For 12 years, he haunted transport systems, disguised as an inconspicuous, pitiful older man. While the police, blinded by ideology, searched for a young and strong perpetrator, Chikatilo murdered at least 52 women and children with unimaginable brutality. His acts of mutilation and cannibalism were not only murders, they were an abominable desecration of the human form and human dignity. He represents the evil that flourishes in a society that, for ideological reasons, refuses to admit the existence of such abysses in the first place. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the monster of the Andes and legal helplessness. Pedro Alonso Lopez acted on a scale of horror that seemed more like an unstoppable natural disaster than the work of a single human being. His confession, delivered with a frightening and emotionless indifference, put the number of his victims at more than 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He was like a wandering plague, moving from village to village while shamelessly exploiting the extreme poverty and trust of rural communities. The most terrible thing about his story, however, is not only the number of victims, but what happened after his arrest. Because of legal gaps and bureaucratic chaos between states, he was released after years of imprisonment. In 1994, he was released from prison in Ecuador and later disappeared from public view. The world remains with the terrifying question of where this black hole of death is hiding today. Ted Bundy, the charming living Trojan horse. Ted Bundy was so frightening because he shattered the centuries-old illusion that monsters must also look monstrous. He was good-looking, highly intelligent, eloquent, and a law student, exactly the type of man that parents would proudly present as a son-in-law. He masterfully used this all-American charm as a weapon by pretending to be injured or by posing as an authority figure in order to lull his victims into a false sense of safety. His evil did not lie only in the violence of his actions, but also in the deep psychological deception. Bundy proved that the most dangerous predator is not the one hiding in the bushes, but who smiles at you in broad daylight and makes you wonder whether you can ever truly trust another human being again. Jack the Ripper, the phantom in the Victorian fog. Jack the Ripper is far more than a historical serial killer. He is a permanent part of our collective cultural nightmare. He did not only murder his victims in the foggy, labyrinth-like alleys of Victorian London. He turned the entire metropolis into a stage for his macabre and grotesque theater of death. The surgical precision of his mutilations fed the terrifying speculation that he might be a doctor or even a member of the royal family. Yet above all, his psychological warfare through mocking letters sent to the press cemented his myth for all eternity. Because he was never caught and never identified, he remains the faceless embodiment of the ultimate urban fear. An intelligent, calculating, and phantom-like evil that emerges from the crowd, does the indescribable, and then disappears forever into anonymity. Charles Manson, the dark messiah of manipulation. The true horror of Charles Manson lay in the fact that he never had to raise a hand against anyone himself in order to become one of the most infamous murderers in history. His power was far more insidious than physical violence. In the chaotic and searching atmosphere of the late 1960s, Manson styled himself as a dark messiah who gathered lost and vulnerable young people around him in a cult called the Family. As an absolute master of psychological manipulation, he used a mixture of drugs, personal charisma, and bizarre apocalyptic prophecies to systematically destroy the personalities of his followers and rebuild them as mere tools of his own insane will. He proved to the world that charismatic evil only has to whisper softly in order to turn other human beings into living, breathing murder weapons. Roy DeMeo, The Industrial Efficiency of the Gemini Method. In the underworld of the New York Mafia, where a human life was often worth less than a cheap meal, Roy DeMeo perfected a process that made people disappear with frightening professionalism. DeMeo was a true innovator of industrial death. He developed the so-called Gemini method, an assembly line procedure for eliminating people without leaving traces. Victims were lured into the Gemini lounge, executed there with lightning speed, and immediately taken to a special apartment. There, a team dismembered the body within a few hours so thoroughly that absolutely nothing remained. This was not about anger or passion, but about the cold, businesslike disposal of human beings. The terror of the DeMeo crew was the certainty that, with ice-cold efficiency, a person could be turned within a very short time into a few anonymous garbage bags. Shiro Ishii, The Ethical Abyss of Unit 731. Dr. Shiro Ishii represents the absolute lowest point of human civilization and scientific ethics. He took the noble pursuit of knowledge and twisted it into a tool for unimaginable sadism. As the head of Japan's Unit 731 during the Second World War, he operated a vast death camp, cynically disguised as a research facility. There, thousands of prisoners, whom he referred to only as Maruta, or logs, were dissected alive and without any anesthesia. He deliberately infected them with plague or syphilis and used them as living targets for new flamethrowers and bombs. The most horrifying chapter of this story is that Ishii was never punished. He and his scientists received immunity from the United States in exchange for their bloody research data. The man who organized hell on earth was allowed to spend the rest of his days in peace and quiet. Ivan the Terrible, the destructive paranoia of absolute power. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, serves as a timeless and terrifying example of how a brilliant mind can turn into monstrous paranoia. His reign began promisingly, but quickly sank into the Oprichnina, an era of state-sanctioned terror. He created a private army of black-clad enforcers, the Oprichniki, who rode through the country with a severed dog's head and a broom attached to their saddles, symbols of their mission to sniff out treason and sweep it away. They answered only to Ivan and unleashed a wave of public massacres, such as the brutal sack of Novgorod. The ultimate symbol of his tyranny, however, was personal in nature. In an uncontrolled fit of rage, he struck down his own son and heir. With that, he murdered the future of Russia with the same hands that had once built his empire. Ranavalona I, the fanatical queen of Madagascar. Ranavalona I of Madagascar received the nickname the Mad Queen, yet her terror came from a deeply rational, although fanatical, desire to preserve the independence of her nation from European colonial powers. However, her methods for reaching that goal turned her 33-year reign into a nightmare of self-destruction. She saw traitors and foreign sympathizers everywhere. Her favorite tool was the Tangina ritual. The accused had to swallow poison and 3 pieces of chicken skin. If they did not vomit up all 3 pieces, or if they died from the poison, they were considered guilty. This bizarre form of justice, combined with forced labor, decimated her own population. In her desire to save Madagascar from outsiders, she killed a devastating part of her own people and became a monster far more terrible than any enemy at her gates. Pol Pot, total destruction through year 0. Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime were not simply murderers. They were the architects of a social reset so radical and violent that it remains almost impossible to comprehend. When they came to power in Cambodia in 1975, they declared Year 0. They immediately and brutally emptied the cities and drove millions of people into the countryside in order to force a twisted agrarian utopia. But this utopia was built on the bodies of citizens. They systematically dismantled all of society. Family bonds were torn apart, religions were banned, and knowledge itself became a death sentence. Simply wearing glasses or knowing a foreign language could be interpreted as proof of intellectual corruption and could lead to execution. The killing fields were the cruel end result, where more than 1 million people were beaten to death or killed by the simplest means. Pol Pot's terror was the ultimate ideological nightmare. Leopold II, the ice-cold administrative evil in the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium is terrifying proof that some of the greatest atrocities in world history were committed not out of ideology, but out of pure greed for profit. He convinced the world that his interest in Africa was purely humanitarian, while securing for himself a vast territory that he cynically called the Congo Free State. It was anything but free. It was his private property, which he ran like a gigantic slave plantation. His agents terrorized the population in order to extract rubber and ivory. The methods were truly demonic. Every village had to fulfill a rubber quota, and if the quota was not met, women were taken hostage, or children had their hands and feet cut off. Leopold became one of the richest men in the world in his Brussels palace by orchestrating a catastrophe in which millions of people died. His terror was the cold evil of a balance sheet, in which human lives were only costs. Nader Shah, the paranoid decay of a military genius. Nader Shah, the Persian ruler of the 18th century, was a military genius who rose from nothing to forge a vast empire. But as his power grew, so did his paranoia, and his brilliant mind began to rot into a mass of cruelty. His descent into madness is seen most clearly in his invasion of Delhi. After some of his soldiers were killed during an uprising, he unleashed his rage and ordered a massacre that cost tens of thousands of residents their lives in a single day. His cruelty became legendary and deeply personal. Because he suspected his own son of betrayal, he had him blinded and later executed nobles who had witnessed his grief because he interpreted their pity as unforgivable weakness. Nader Shah represents the terrible end of a great leader who was so consumed by fear that his own officers eventually had to murder him in order to end the nightmare. Timur, Tamerlane, and the monuments made of skulls. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was a 14th century conqueror who did not merely defeat his enemies, but used their remains to cement his terrifying legacy. He was a master of psychological warfare, whose trademark was a form of architectural terror. When a city resisted him, he built grotesque monuments from the bodies of the defeated. His most infamous practice was the construction of towers from the severed skulls of the dead. After suppressing a revolt in Isfahan, he ordered the construction of more than 24 towers made from an estimated 70,000 skulls, a macabre skyline of death as a warning to the entire world. He once had 4,000 soldiers buried alive. His terror lay in the artistic calculations with which he displayed the consequences of disobedience and ensured that his name would forever remain linked with absolute fear. Attila the Hun, the unstoppable scourge of God. Attila the Hun was less a king and more a destructive force of nature. He was like a human earthquake that rolled across Europe in the 5th century and left a trail of absolute devastation behind it. His title, the Scourge of God, was well-deserved. He and his nomadic warriors were the embodiment of a nihilistic fury of destruction. They did not seek order or construction, but plunder and annihilation. Cities were not simply conquered. They were often burned so thoroughly that, according to legend, grass would never grow there again. For the collapsing Roman Empire and the other civilizations of Europe, Attila was the apocalypse made flesh. He was the feared outsider whose motives were brutally simple: gold and ruin. His horror lies in his role as the great destroyer, whose main influence on history was smoking rubble and the collective trauma of an entire era. Muammar al-Gaddafi, the unpredictable theatricality of terror. Muammar al-Gaddafi was a special kind of frightening because he mixed the oppression of a dictator with the surreal and unpredictable theatricality of a madman. For 42 years, he ruled Libya through a mixture of fear and a bizarre personality cult. His cruelty was often a public spectacle. He had the executions of opponents broadcast on state television and forced citizens to watch. He surrounded himself with a female Amazonian guard and gave hours-long, rambling speeches that left the world stunned and his own people in constant fear of his next whim. The horror of Gaddafi was his total volatility. He was a paranoid, megalomaniacal tyrant who saw conspiracies everywhere and whose rule was completely arbitrary, holding an entire nation as a psychological hostage for more than 4 decades. Augusto Pinochet, the silent and bureaucratic disappearance of people. The terror of the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet was a quiet, almost bureaucratic kind of evil, but it was no less horrifying. After his coup in 1973, his regime perfected the art of simply making opponents disappear. He did not always create martyrs through public executions. Instead, his secret police abducted political opponents in broad daylight from the streets and took them to secret torture centers, from which many never returned. His infamous caravan of death consisted of military special units that flew from prison to execute dissidents. It is estimated that thousands of bodies were thrown from helicopters into the Pacific Ocean. This method was a particularly cruel form of psychological warfare because it literally erased people from existence and left their families in eternal agonizing uncertainty, a wound that could never heal. Saddam Hussein, the lesson of totalitarian terror. Saddam Hussein's rule over Iraq was a lesson in modern totalitarian terror, a regime built on a foundation of absolute fear and paranoia. His power was secured not only by a huge military, but also by an omnipresent network of secret police and informants that turned neighbors against neighbors. His cruelest act, however, was the use of chemical weapons against his own people. The poison gas attack on Halabja on March 16, 1988, was not simply an act of war, but an act of genocide. He unleashed a cocktail of mustard gas and nerve agents on a Kurdish city and killed thousands of civilians in a single day. People died in their homes and on the streets, their bodies frozen in the final moments of their lives. Saddam's terror was the ultimate betrayal by a leader who viewed his own citizens as vermin to be destroyed when they became inconvenient. François Duvalier, Papa Doc, and the merging with Vodou. François Duvalier, better known as Papa Doc, was the tyrant of Haiti. Yet he ruled less like a president and more like a dark high priest. He understood the deeply rooted cultural power of Vodou and used it masterfully as a tool of psychological control. He styled himself after Baron Samedi, the spirit of death, spoke with a slow nasal voice, and almost never took off his dark sunglasses. This supernatural persona was supported by the very real terror of his private militia, the Tonton Macoute. Named after a bogeyman from Haitian folklore, they were a force of unrestrained cruelty responsible for the torture and murder of tens of thousands of people. Chouini truly believed that they were supernatural demons. The horror of Papa Doc was the dark fusion of state power and spiritual fear, which paralyzed his people through fear of the living and the dead alike. Mary I, Bloody Mary, and religious fanaticism. Queen Mary of England will forever be known by the nickname Bloody Mary, and for good reason. Her terror was that of a religious fanatic armed with the absolute power of the state. Driven by a fanatical desire to return England to Catholicism, she unleashed waves of persecution against Protestants that became a national trauma. Her trademark was burning people at the stake. Almost 300 people were condemned as heretics and subjected to this painfully slow death. These were not silent executions, but cruel spectacles meant to plant fear into the hearts of all who dared to defy the Queen's faith. Mary's reign is a terrifying reminder of how the personal piety of a ruler, when it turns into uncompromising fanaticism, can transform an entire nation into a landscape of fire and fear. Tomás de Torquemada, the architect of institutionalized fear. In an age of religious zeal, Torquemada stands out as the ultimate architect of institutionalized terror. As the first Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, he was the head of an efficient machine designed to purify faith through paranoia and pain. Under his 15-year leadership, the Inquisition became a shadow power that haunted every corner of society. Anonymous accusations were often enough to send someone to a dungeon. Torquemada perfected systematic torture as a moral tool for forcing confessions. He was responsible for the burning of thousands of alleged heretics and for the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Jews and Muslims. His horror was the cold bureaucratic evil of a fanatic who firmly believed that he was doing God's work, rack by rack and stake by stake. Cesare Borgia, the ruthless prince of the Renaissance. Cesare Borgia was the frightening embodiment of the dark side of the Renaissance, a world in which political ambition had been detached from all morality. As the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, he possessed the audacity and papal support to create his own realm in Italy through betrayal and violence. He was a master of silent killing and preferred the elegant efficiency of poison, often said to have been administered through the infamous Cantarella mixture. Many believed that he had murdered his own brother in order to consolidate his power, although that accusation is not historically proven. He was a figure of such cold pragmatism that he became one of the main inspirations for Machiavelli's work, The Prince. The horror of the Borgias was the refined, ice-cold evil of a predator in fine silk for whom human lives were nothing more than pawns in his great game for power. Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, the wolf of Rimini and mythical evil. While many nobles of the Renaissance were cruel, Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta played in a league entirely of his own. He was a man of such spectacular wickedness that his contemporaries believed he was a demon in human form. Behind the facade of a brilliant military commander and patron of the arts hid a private life full of depravity that shocked even the hardened minds of the 15th century. The charges against him were a list of every imaginable sin: the murder of 2 wives, the violation of his own daughter, and widespread plundering. His evil was so legendary that Pope Pius II took the unprecedented step of holding an official ceremony to condemn him to hell while he was still alive. Malatesta is one of those rare figures whose personal cruelty was so extreme that it crossed the boundary of crime and entered the realm of mythological evil. Maximilien de Robespierre, virtue as the architect of terror. Robespierre began as a passionate defender of the people and as the incorruptible voice of the French Revolution. Yet he became a terrible lesson in how the pursuit of abstract virtue can lead to a bloodbath. As a leader of the Committee of Public Safety, he became the architect of the Reign of Terror, a time in which liberty and equality were enforced by the guillotine. Driven by a paranoid obsession with destroying all enemies of the revolution, he created a culture of denunciation in which one wrong word could mean a death sentence. The terror devoured tens of thousands of people, from aristocrats to ordinary citizens. Robespierre's horror was the transformation of a puritanical idealist into a tyrant who theoretically loved humanity so much that he had no problem executing real human beings in masses in order to force his perfect society into existence. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the giant of American terror. Nathan Bedford Forrest, embodies three different eras of racist terror in America in one terrifying figure. Before the Civil War, he was a millionaire and slave trader who became rich through the business of human beings. During the war, he was a brilliant but brutal Confederate general, infamous for the Fort Pillow Massacre, in which his troops killed hundreds of black soldiers, many of whom had already tried to surrender. But his most lasting and terrifying legacy came after the war. Out of hatred for racial equality, he became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and placed his military prestige in the service of a terrorist organization whose legacy still exists today. Forrest was not only a participant in a cruel system, he was a leader and innovator of racist hatred throughout his life. He was a giant of American horror. Vlad the Impaler, from historical monster to immortal nightmare. And finally, we come to the man whose name literally became synonymous with his preferred method of execution, Vlad the Impaler. The Prince of Wallachia in the 15th century was not merely a ruler, he was a master of macabre theater, and the battlefield was his stage. While other tyrants were cruel, Vlad was an artist of torment, and his tool was the sharpened stake. Impalement was a uniquely horrifying death, a slow process that could last for days, while the victim's own body weight drove them deeper onto the stake. But for Vlad, it was not only about killing. It was about a message written in human suffering. His masterpiece of terror was the infamous Forest of the Impaled, where he greeted an Ottoman invading army with the sight of 20,000 impaled prisoners, a rotting landscape of death stretching for miles. He was a monster of such legendary cruelty that his real actions inspired the greatest vampire story of